Thank you, Mr. Pitella. The Earl of Dartmouth wishes to put a question to you. Do you agree?
Pitella, thank you for taking my question. In your speech, the translator described you describing the nomination of Mr. Juncker as a victory for democracy. At the next session of the Parliament, will Mr. Juncker's name be the only name put forward for the Parliament to vote on? And if Mr. Juncker's name is the only name put forward for the Parliament to vote on, as has always happened in past precedents, how can this possibly be a victory for democracy, even for a socialist?
Yes, okay.
Caro collega.
Dear colleague, let me explain in simple terms. First of all, the governments get together and they nominate a President of the Commission. That's not a demonstration of great democracy. For the first time in history, there was an electoral campaign where the big European political families indicated the personalities, and the citizens cast their vote in cognizance of those personalities, and the majority result of the vote was for Mr. Juncker. The democratic consequence of that is the nomination of Mr. Juncker. I think that can't be too difficult to get your head around.
Thank you.
Kamal, now for the Liberals and Democrats, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Mr. President, first of all, welcome to the new group's leaders who are here, Manfred Weber, Mr. Pitella and Mr. Kamal. You shall see we are a funny club. You have the most sympathetic people are Rebecca naturally and Mrs. Zimmer. The most outspoken one is naturally Mr. Farage, and you shall see I'm the most disciplined one in this whole house. That said, let's be honest about it. The most important outcome of this European Council was one thing. That was the nomination of Jean-Claude Juncker as candidate president of the European Commission. And I don't understand all the criticism that has been put forward to Mr. Pitella in saying that's not democratic. The procedure is exactly the same as David Cameron is nominated in the British Parliament. So I don't see any problem. I recognize the British democracy is a real democracy, and it is time also to recognize that this Parliament is the real European democracy of the European continent. So, instead of criticizing this, I think it's a big victory for the European Parliament, and not so much for the European Parliament, Mr. President, but for the European democracy and the European citizens that Mr. Juncker has been proposed. And we are now, in my opinion, entering in fact what I call a second phase of the process, because it's to Mr. Juncker now, as it is also the case in the British Parliament and in the British democracy, to find a majority around him, to make a coalition around him. And in my opinion, it has to be a broad coalition, a stable coalition, a pro-European coalition and majority of people and of groups who want to negotiate a programme and who want to have a new strategy of change for this European Union. And when I'm talking about change, I'm talking about real change. Not what Mr. Kamal has said is calling for. He has used, I think, at least 10 times the word change is an intervention, but what he is calling change, I'm calling it blocking all progress. It's going out of the euro, it's breaking up Schengen, it's stalling labour mobility, it's abandoning all European common policies. So less integration, less Europe. That's no change, that's regression, dear colleagues. Regression it is. No. What does it mean, the word conservative? Well, nothing, yeah, that's a good explanation. But if it means anything, that it means that status quo. Conservatism is status quo, and that is what we don't want with this European Union today.
Well, I'd just like to clarify a point that Mr Verhofstadt made, actually. Mr Cameron is actually a Member of Parliament for Witney. He is elected. Mr Juncker has not been elected by the people. That is the key difference, Mr Verhofstadt, and that is a reason why people are turning against the European Union.
I can only say one thing. I have seen Mr Juncker together with Mr Schulz and together with Ska Keller, who is not there, and with Mr José Bové in all the debates for this European Parliament. He has been fully involved in this European election. I didn't see you in this European election. I didn't see even Mr Cameron in this European election. After the European election, he came forward to say that a number of things have to be changed, that Mr Juncker could be nominated. So, in my opinion, this is real European democracy, these debates and this public opinion.
EFDD, Mr Farage.
Well, good morning. And what a privilege to address the three great presidents of the European Union on behalf of my group and on behalf of UKIP, which topped the poll in the United Kingdom. Not, of course, that it just happened there. Right across Europe, on the left, the centre and the right, there are now more Eurosceptics in this Parliament than have ever been seen before. So imagine my surprise on the 27th of May as I headed to the Conference of Presidents meeting in Brussels, where the leaders of all the European groups sat in a room, and I wasn't sure, would they be nice to me? Would they be nasty to me? Would they accept that something fundamental had changed? Oh no, it was business as usual. And coming from the UK, we didn't even realise that these elections were seen to be significant as far as the next Commission President was concerned. The Tories didn't have a horse in the race, the British Labour Party disowned Martin Schulz, and the Liberal Democrats, who I'm pleased to say collapsed to one member. Had you put old Verhofstadt on the British television, they'd have lost the lot. So we were pretty unaware. We were pretty unaware of what was going on. A victory for democracy? I'm not sure. The loser? Who's the loser? Martin Schulz. He's become the President again of the European Parliament. It all looks like a bit of a stitch-up to me. Dave obviously misunderstood the mood, not understanding this, and after some initial encouragement from a few other member states thinking they might block Mr Juncker, he then ran into the new golden rule of EU politics, which is when Mrs Merkel speaks, the other heads of state obey. And the support for us simply melted away. You would have thought, when in a hole, stop digging, but no, Dave kept on digging away. And I must say, as the final vote approached, it began to feel a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, where it doesn't really matter how good the British entry is, such is the dislike of our country around much of Europe, that we're always going to lose. I wonder what the prospects are now for renegotiation. Well, Mr Juncker has had a rough ride in the British press. We're told that he drinks cognac for breakfast. Yeah, I know that is not in the UKIP manifesto, I promise you. We're told he's Juncker the drunker. We're told he's a smoker. My God, isn't that awful? Some have even said that he drinks endless cups of black coffee, which is why he looks so old. I can't see him being in any mood to concede. And back to Mrs Merkel. She made it clear after the summit, when Cameron challenged the principle of ever closer union, she very gracefully said that we're all allowed to move at different speeds towards ever closer union, but we must continue in the same direction. We've got a referendum coming up at some point in the not too distant future in Britain. There is one thing that would convince the British voters to vote to remain part of a European Union, and that is a fundamental treaty change that says we no longer have to accept untramelled access to countless millions of people from across the whole of Europe. We need, and the British people demand, 80% of them want us to get back control of our borders so we can choose who comes to Britain. Now, having lost 26-2 in the last vote in the Council of Ministers, we're going to need to do this, to succeed with this, to end total free movement. We're going to need the support of the European Parliament? Are you going to help Britain to end the free movement of peoples? I don't think so. Are we going to win 28-0 in the Council of Ministers? I don't think so. It isn't going to happen. We're whistling in the wind, and we are closer now to exit than ever. And for the rest of the EU, I suspect the next 5 years will bring endless misery for the southern Mediterranean Eurozone countries. That perhaps is reflected by the number of Italians we now have in our group. And what have we seen in the last 48 hours? We've seen naked militarism, with the EU flag being virtually goose-stepped round the yard. We've seen the European anthem, and actually, I'll tell you this, we now, the Eurosceptics, are the progressives. These two gentlemen had nothing to say today. It was the usual dirge-like dull, looking back to a model invented 50 years ago, and we're the ones that want democracy, we're the ones that want nation-state, we're the ones that want a global future for our countries, not to be trapped inside this museum. Thank you.
Mr. Verhofstadt. Mr. Verhofstadt, please settle down.
Mr. Farage, what are you doing here? What I heard is basically the speech of the opposition. Mr. Verhofstadt. Mr. Verhofstadt, I'd like some respect, please. Mr. Farage, what are you doing here? What I heard is the speech of the leader of the opposition in the House of Commons. If you want to hold that kind of speech, get elected there. What are you doing here? The reason why you are speaking here is that you have enlisted continental Europeans in your group just to be able to boast as a British citizen who wants to get out of the European Union. If you want to be considered as the leader of a European political group, then make speeches of a European political leader. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Lamberts, I have to say, you sound like somebody from the old communist era saying that if anybody else has a different point of view, clearly they're mentally ill or there is something wrong with them. What you're going to have to get used to, all of you, is the idea that across the political spectrum there are now more Eurosceptics in this Parliament than there have ever been, and many of them do not subscribe to ever closer union. They don't subscribe to that flag. They don't want a European anthem. They want a modern Europe where we can trade together, cooperate together and have mutual respect for each other. And I'll tell you this, Mr. Lamberts, don't worry too much about my presence, because within the next 5 years I won't be here. All right?
Okay, vielen Dank.
Mr. Carthy, 1 minute.
Voters across Europe, including Ireland, sent a very clear message to their governments and to the EU in May. That message, unfortunately, has been ignored by the recent European Council meeting. The austerity agenda that has been championed by European institutions has inflicted hardship on many families in Ireland and throughout Member States. The European Council has missed an opportunity to change direction, to abandon the policies that have created mass unemployment, mass emigration, that have hugely increased poverty levels and which have caused stagnation in domestic economies. Instead, the Council concentrated on a carve-up of top jobs in the European institutions and ignored the impact of their austerity agenda. It's time for a new Europe of equal states, working against austerity and for investment in jobs and public services.
Dan Dodds, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. The recent European elections delivered a stark message to these institutions. Across Europe, people went to the ballot box not to commend the EU for work done, but to express disillusionment and to call for radical change in how Brussels operates. That genuine desire for a better Europe must not be ignored. In the United Kingdom, but not solely in the United Kingdom, the consensus is that Europe isn't working. People see an EU that has lost its way, obsessed with ever closer union, rather than what it was intended for: trade, cooperation and friendship. After the European Summit and the anointing of Mr. Juncker, and listening to the tone of this debate, I fear that the European establishment intend to answer the people with more of the same. More of the same economic and monetary union that has given record unemployment and a generation of young people condemned to long-term unemployment and loss of hope. Colleagues, it is time for change. Sadly, the tone of this debate suggests business as usual.
Mr. Wilimski, 1 minute.
Do you really think your state, your peoples, your cultures are represented by you here? We had very low turnout, and there's 80% of people didn't vote. Please, this kind of European project is not relevant any longer. I'm from Austria. I was 8 years in the European Parliament. I left to say that my country, my people want competences back. We want sovereignty back, and we are not willing to accept a European nomenclature that wasn't voted by 80% of vote will determine our future. We don't want to be part of this. We saw the deals that was cut, the stitch up, Mr. Juncker and so forth. The speaker's cut off.